Okay, in this video, I am going to go through activity-based costing, right? We're going to allocate overhead based on activity. And again, I think the PowerPoint slides make it look too complicated. Um, yeah, that just seems so complicated to me. All we're really saying in activity-based costing, um, is that we are going to again think of our overhead in terms of 4,800,000, right? That's the total overhead associated with making our go-karts. And now what we're going to do is instead of breaking out the overhead by department, we're just going to break it out by activity, right? So if you think about how we would make a go-kart, there are various activities that are associated with making the go-kart. And without getting, into any of this stuff, right? If we were to just look at the top line, all we're really saying in this approach is that we are going to allocate overhead based on activity, and these are the four different activities. The first one is we have production, and I'm not necessarily sure what that involves, but that is an activity associated with making the go kart. And then we have setup, and then finally we have design and factory services, right? But we originally had 4,800,000, and if we were to use a single plant wide overhead allocation rate, we would pick, I think we were using direct labor hours. Now we're just saying, hey, of the 4,800,000, how much of it relates to production, that specific activity, how much relates to setup, how much relates to design, and how much relates to factory services. And then we would just, as we make our go kart, right, through these activities, we're just going to allocate some of our overhead from each one of these activities to the go kart. And then in addition, the go kart has direct labor, direct material, and then the manufacturing overhead that we allocate is based on each one of these different activities. Okay. So now I think maybe we can go back to the PowerPoint slides and basically say, okay, listen, first step, let's just take the 4,800,000 and break it up into those four separate activities. So we're saying 600,000 relates to the production process, right? Setup is going to require 2 million in overhead costs. Design, that's going to require 1,200,000 in overhead costs. And then finally, factory services is going to be 1 million. Okay. And then step two really is, okay, let's allocate production based on direct labor hours. And we're expecting 100,000 direct labor hours in production or associated with production. And therefore, I think we would say, let's allocate $6 of overhead for every hour of labor that we incur. Then we would allocate setup based on the number of setups. And if there are 200 setups and 2 million in overhead, then are we not saying that the setup would be 2,000 per setup? And then design, we've got 1,200,000 in overhead, and we're going to allocate it based on the number of design changes. And if there are 10 design changes, then are we saying that each design change we are going to allocate 120,000 in overhead? And then finally, factory services, we're going to allocate that based on square feet. And if I've got 20,000 square feet, then I could allocate, you're going to kill me, but is that not $5 per square foot? Okay. I think that's what, okay, fine, fair enough. I did the math wrong. It's 50. But I think I did everything else right. Right? This is what they are doing. This is the same concept. Now, above, right? Above, they're saying, hey, listen, the standard model is going to work through all of those activities and it's going to require 75,000 labor hours. And that's important, remember, because we said we would allocate production based on labor hours. And then it's going to require 40 setups. And that's important because we said when we get to the setup activity, we're going to allocate $10,000 per setup. Then design changes. That's important. The standard model requires no design changes. Okay. And if it doesn't require any design changes, then we're not allocating any of the design overhead to the standard model. And then finally, the standard model is going to use 12,000 square feet of the factory. And therefore, that's important because we said when we get down to factory services, we are going to allocate that $1 million in overhead based on the square foot. And so we're going to allocate $50 per square foot applied to 12,000 square feet. Then I think we can take all of this information, the usage, in addition to the way that we are going to allocate, and we can now figure out how much overhead we would allocate to the standard model, right? Again, here are the 4 activities. 1, 2, 3, 4. We just walked through them all. We said the standard model is going to use 75,000 hours of labor. We're going to allocate $6 of overhead associated with the production process. And therefore we are allocating 450,000. And then we're going to do the same for setup and design. We said there were no designs, no design changes. And then factory services, we said we would allocate based on square footage, 12,000 square feet. There's a total of $50 per square foot, so 600,000, right? So the total overhead, 1,450,000. And then I think we're making 5,000 specific standard go-karts, and therefore each go-kart is going to get $290 of overhead allocated to it. Alternatively, we would do the same thing with the custom, and then we would divide by the number of customs, and therefore we would get overhead of 3,350. And then we would look at, again, this is what we just captured, and then we would add the direct materials, and that's pretty consistent across any overhead allocation method we employ. It's always going to be the same material cost, and it's always going to be the same labor cost. We're just refining the way that we allocate overhead. And I think there's a good summary schedule, right? So again, just focusing on this bottom half, right? And just looking at the standard model, we were saying that the plant-wide approach would allocate $720 of overhead to the standard model. And then we said, let's break that out into departmental, and we refined it slightly. And we alternatively allocated 690 in overhead. Then we got really refined. We used activity-based costing, and we ended up only allocating $290 of overhead to the standard model. And then alternatively, as we became more refined, we went from allocating $1,200 based on the single plant-wide approach to $3,350 using the activity-based approach. Right? And so now I think the box is saying overhead costs allocated to custom models is higher under ABC costs because custom models use more activities that drive overhead costs, right? So it's requiring more time and energy, and therefore it makes sense that we're going to be allocating the most to the custom bike or the custom go-kart. All right. I like point four. Low volume complex products are undercosted, and high volume simpler products are overcosted under plant wide and departmental, right? So what we're saying is, look, when we're using a relatively easy approach to allocate, okay, low volume products are undercosted. So we're saying, listen, if we don't produce a lot, like the go karts, and it's a highly complex process to make it, under the plant wide, we are under costing, right? We're only saying it costs us 1,200 in overhead, whereas in reality it costs us 3,350. That's what we mean by the plant wide under costs. And then high volume, simple products are overcosted. And the opposite's true. If we're using a single plant wide, it's 720 as opposed to the most refined 290. So using the plant wide, we're allocating too much cost to the high volume products.